A reading from the Gospel according to Matthew, chapter 5, verses 21 through 37. Listen for a good word from the Lord. You have heard that it was said to those of ancient times, "You shall not murder, and whoever murders shall be liable to judgment." But I say to you that if you are angry with a brother or sister, you will be liable to judgment. And if you insult a brother or sister, you will be liable to the council. And if you say, "You fool," you will be liable to the hell of fire. So, when you are offering your gift at the altar, if you remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother or sister, and then come and offer your gift. Come to terms quickly with your accuser while you are on the way to court with him, or your accuser may hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the guard, and you will be thrown into prison. Truly, I tell you, you will never get out until you have paid the last penny. You have heard that it was said, "You shall not commit adultery." But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one of your members than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one of your members than for your whole body to go into hell. It was also said, "Whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce." But I say to you that anyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of unchastity, causes her to commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Again, you have heard that it was said to those of ancient times, "You shall not swear falsely, but carry out the vows you have made to the Lord." But I say to you, do not swear at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great King. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot make one hair black or white. Let your word be yes, yes, or no, no. Anything more than this comes from the evil one. This is the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ. Thanks be to God. The entire Bible, our faith perspective on the origins of humanity, starts out with the story of the creation of the world. It tells of God speaking everything into creation, forming humans, and breathing the breath of life into us. From the moment of their creation, all humans, both male and female equally, become image bearers of the divine. In God's own image, God created us. It has been said that if we were able to see each person in the world around us appropriately, as they walked toward us, we would see angelic figures out in front of them, heralding their coming, proclaiming, "Make way for the image of God. Make way for the image of God." As humans, created in the image of God, we become linked together as sisters and brothers. Regardless of race, place of origin, citizenship, gender, or even religion, we are connected as those created in the image of God. But if you remember the rest of the origin story, you know that it didn't take long before we took that for granted and determined that the image of God could easily be disposed of. The relationship with God was harmed. The relationship within the human family was harmed as well. Adam and Eve disobeyed and think that they can go their own way. Adam even blames Eve for their failure. "That woman you gave me, she made me do it." Their son Cain becomes jealous of his brother Abel, so jealous, in fact, that he eventually kills him. Eventually, God confronts Cain. "Where's your brother Abel?" God asks, certainly knowing already what has happened. And here, Cain responds with a question that has plagued humanity ever since it was first recorded. Cain asks God back, "Am I my brother's keeper?" We'll jump on over to the first book of the New Testament, the Gospel of Matthew. And we find Jesus teaching his disciples and the crowds that are listening in on the side of a mountain. He is trying to give them a clear understanding of what life is like on God's terms, in God's new reality that Jesus was initiating among them. It is into that new reality that he wants them to live. They have to be different. and act differently than the rest of the world. One of the lessons he seems to want to instill is essentially that in God's realm, in God's kingdom, in God's reality, we live in relationship with all of those around us, regardless of who they are. Everyone is our brother or sister, and what we do and say to them matters. So to answer Cain's question, in God's eyes, we are their keepers and they are ours. Human relationships define so much about us, and living in the right way requires deep self-examination and daily struggle. It requires a righteousness greater than even the scribes or the Pharisees, Jesus says. Our actions, whether we realize it or not, whether we like it or not, impact those around us. And we must take responsibility for them. We must also take responsibility for the inner life that leads to outer actions. We may not be able to control every thought that enters our minds, but we can control the things on which we meditate and that we let linger within us. Jesus says he's the fulfillment of the law. He's already told them that he is not changing the law or replacing it. In fact, he's intensifying their understanding of it. He's also liberating them in this teaching, freeing them to live in new ways that aren't controlled by inner demons. He's saying that the law and the commandments, if lived out as he teaches them, have transformative power for us, and they transform us from the inside out. It's easy enough for you and me to hear a commandment that says, "You will not kill." Sure, we may have heard someone say something like, "I was so mad I could have killed him." But only on the rarest of occasions would the majority of us think it was a real threat. Unfortunately, we also know that people continue to be killed every day. And each life taken before its time is a tragedy and breaks God's heart as it should ours. But only the smallest percentage of people you and I know would ever truly consider taking another person's life, and even fewer would ever actually go through with it. So perhaps knowing this, Jesus intensifies the requirement. It isn't just about actual acts of taking someone's life. Obviously, that will bring judgment from the court of law and from God. But he's also concerned with the anger that we hold inside of us for someone else. Anger, if left unexamined and unchecked, can have serious and irreparable impacts on your life, on your outlook on the world, and on the way you relate to others. If you're not careful, the anger will become what controls you and drives your actions against someone else. You will end up insulting them. You will end up working to spite them or do them harm. You will end up calling them a fool. It will cause you to lose sight of the very humanity and divine image that binds us to those with whom we are in relationship. When Jesus addresses calling people fools here, he isn't simply talking about looking at what someone does and thinking, "Oh, what a lovable idiot." It isn't even about looking at someone who does something that's so outlandish you can't even believe it. It seems just outright stupid. And this isn't even as simple as our parents teaching us that we shouldn't call people stupid or any other mean name for that matter, because it's just impolite. And as they say, if you don't have anything nice to say, well, you shouldn't say anything at all. No, it goes even deeper to one of our greatest issues today. With all of the division we have in this world and in our own communities, with all of the polarization, with all of the tribalism, our issue isn't simple disagreement with people that are around us. Our issue is disgust. The nature of our world right now is such that we are likely to be on one side of an issue and someone around us, maybe very close to us, is on the other side. And there seems to be such cognitive dissonance between the two perspectives, though, that we cannot imagine how they can hold that view or act in that way. And they likely feel the same way about us. But we don't just disagree with one another. We're disgusted by each other. If you don't believe me, just look back at your social media feeds to see what people were saying about people on the other side of the political aisle during the State of the Union this past Tuesday night. We are so disgusted by those who think differently that we want to have absolutely nothing to do with them. We may not even care what happens to them, which is dangerous when you consider that they say that the opposite of love is not hate, but apathy. What we may not realize is that our disgust has caused us to disregard the other person's basic humanity. We want to write them off. When we think them a fool, they become less than fully human to us. So we think we can easily dismiss them from our lives. Our anger and our disgust with people causes us to completely disregard the divine image held within our fellow human beings. And this not only hurts our relationships with those around us in obvious ways, but it also hurts our relationship with God. Jesus tells his disciples that they must be above all that. They must recognize the divine image in all. And when relationships are broken by actual harm or inner hate, we must work to reconcile. He says that reconciliation in those broken situations is so important that it actually takes precedent over worship. And he doesn't say it lightly either. Jesus is talking to a group of disciples and a crowd in Galilee, which is a good 3 days' journey from the temple in Jerusalem. And when he speaks of making sacrifices at the altar, it's the temple altar that he means. So he basically says to them, imagine that you have made the 3-day journey from your home to Jerusalem. You are worshiping in the temple. You have your sacrifice, and it is your turn to hand it to the priest, to say your prayers, to be blessed, and to worship. And suddenly you realize you have a grudge against someone or that they have one against you. There's some broken relationship in your life. With that broken relationship, it is simply impossible for you to fully worship God with a pure heart. So you ought to leave the animal right there, which is a ridiculous notion because who is going to look after it for you while you're gone? And then walk back to your home those 3 days and spend whatever time is necessary to reconcile with the other person, and then walk the 3 days back to Jerusalem. It sounds absurd, sure, but at least you will be able to worship God with a clear conscience. Our relationships with others are at the heart of God's new reality. And the anger inside of us has such destructive power that Jesus would prefer that we work for reconciliation instead of even gathering with our community of faith for worship. It seems crazy at first, but it makes sense later on when we hear Jesus saying that the greatest commandments are loving God and loving others, and that the two are tied together. You can't fully love God until you are loving your neighbor as you love yourself. Or when he teaches the disciples that when they pray for forgiveness, they need to remember that the forgiveness God would give them is tied to the forgiveness that they would give for others. In God's realm, in God's kingdom, in God's family, the two are tied together. And a broken relationship with those around us breaks our relationship with God as well. Now, when it comes to reconciliation, one scholar actually pointed out that according to Jesus in this text, the responsibility for reconciliation falls upon the party that realizes that the relationship is broken. We might tend to think that it would always be on the responsibility of the offending party to seek reconciliation, but Jesus seems to say that it's the responsibility of the one who recognizes the break first. Sometimes if someone has offended us or hurt us, they might not even know it. And that hurt sinks within us and leads us to destructive anger. And at that point, when we know that the relationship has been broken, we should go to that person, even if, perhaps especially if, they're unaware that they hurt us, and we should be open about it and seek reconciliation. If we are going to be in right relationship with God, we should work to reconcile with others whether we have been hurt or done the hurting. Because true freedom from the pain of these broken relationships only comes when people are reconciled to one another. Jesus doesn't stop there, though. He goes on. He moves from murder and anger to adultery and lust. And again, one goes to the direct commandment first. According to the law, physical intimacy is a gift from God that is designed for those within a covenant relationship with one another. Why? Well, it's rarely ever as casual as people would like to think it could be. Emotions are always involved. People can always be hurt. In ancient times, women were especially vulnerable to this. In many cases, their value and worth in society was seen in their purity and their ability to bear children. And I pray that we know better than that today. But in that time, for a woman to be used for a man's pleasure and then discarded meant that she could be in serious trouble of being unable to fend for herself. She could be seen as devalued, tainted, damaged goods by a system of toxic patriarchy. This was not God's intention. God's intention was mutuality and covenant in which both parties thrive. And that's virtually impossible when the covenant is broken. Still, most of us would never dream of crossing that line, or at least that is what we believe about ourselves. but it can and does happen all the time. And it often starts with something on the inside before it ever gets to the outside. It starts with a lustful thought about someone, then a seemingly harmless flirtation, then a flirtation that ends up being much more than harmless, and then it may turn into some aspect of a relationship that fills some void within a person that should be filled by a relationship with a covenant partner, and then physical intimacy, and then brokenness that must be reconciled. But no matter our covenantal status, lust, like anger, causes us to devalue the humanity of someone else. Again, we can't control every thought that enters our heads, but we can determine where we place our focus and what we use our thoughts for. The dangerous thing is that to use even the thought of someone for our personal pleasure turns that other person into an object to be used and discarded instead of someone created in the image of God. It simply causes you to see that person, whether you know them personally or not, see them in real life or not, as less than human, as a plaything to get rid of when you're bored. It denies the fact that you are bound together even with that person in human relationships simply by being created by the same God. God desires better of us than that. It is our responsibility to look at those around us with full value and worth and as fully human, just as we would hope they would look at us. And anything that objectifies another person prevents our ability to be in relationship with them the way that God would desire us. There's an old story about a group of men who were hanging out in a public setting, and one in the group was admiring the women who walked by and offering pretty graphic commentary on their physical features and the nature of the relationship he would like to have with them. The rest of them seemed to laugh, most of them at least. Some even joined in on occasion. And this went on until one young woman walked by, and the man doing most of the talking was conspicuously quiet. One of the other friends started to describe this young woman, picking up where that first man left off, until the first turned to that other enraged. "You better watch your mouth," he said. "That's my daughter you're talking about." And at that point, one of the friends, one who had been quiet throughout the entire ordeal, finally spoke up and said, "They're all somebody's daughter, aren't they?" The Apostle Paul understood this when he wrote to Timothy and said that he should speak to older women and men with respect, as if they were his own mother or father. And young women and men should be cared for as if they were his own sister or brother, because they are, aren't they? In the eyes of God, we are all sisters and brothers. And perhaps if we begin to see each other that way, we wouldn't treat each other like we wouldn't want our own sister or brother to be treated. We wouldn't even think about others like we wouldn't want someone to think about our own sister or our own brother. So Jesus uses prophetic hyperbole to demonstrate how seriously he takes this. He uses extreme language not to be taken literally. He says that these relationships are so important. They're such a clear mark of the kingdom of God that he uses this absurd idea that for us to deny them, it would be better if we would tear an eye out or cut off a limb. And he does the same with divorce, which he seems to leave some room for when a covenant is truly broken. But he again recognizes the pattern of men that simply discard women for any reason when they are done with them. This was not God's way. And as well, when dealing with that second commandment of taking the Lord's name in vain, you could trace almost everything that people swore by in those days back to something to do with God. Don't tarnish that name, he says. Tell the truth. Live with integrity. Do what you say you're going to do. Treat people with respect. Live so that you can be trusted and there will be no need for anything else. Live with integrity from the inside out. That's hard. But the good news is that reconciliation is possible, both with others and with God. Even when these things happen, Jesus offers forgiveness and a chance to try again. And it seems that the Bible's main prescription for all of these internal feelings is love. Love as Jesus loved. As hard as it may be, replace harmful thoughts and feelings with love. Remember that in the eyes of God, that other person is your sister or brother, so love them accordingly. That is the daily struggle of faith. Will we always get it right? Certainly not. But it's all about God's grace and forgiveness and reconciliation and the chance to try again. That's the kind of community that Christ was initiating. That's God's desire for the world. It's about relationships, and it can transform us from the inside out. Thanks be to God for that. Amen.